The morning of February 23, 1944, broke clear and bright over the East China Sea. Aboard the USS Sunfish, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Shelby stood at the periscope, watching the horizon with the kind of focused intensity that came from 48 consecutive hours on patrol. The submarine had been tracking a convoy since dawn the previous day. 3 cargo ships, and what appeared to be a tanker, escorted by a single frigate. Standard procedure dictated patience, wait for nightfall, submerge, attack from below. But Shelby had received new intelligence from Pearl Harbor that changed everything, and as he watched the tanker's smoke trail against the cloudless sky, he made a decision that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. "Surface the boat," he ordered. The diving officer repeated the command, and compressed air hissed into the ballast tanks. The Sunfish rose from the depths, her conning tower breaking through the waves into full daylight. On the bridge, Shelby raised his binoculars and studied the Japanese convoy, now just 4,000 yards away. The tanker, later identified as the Goyo Maru, continued on her course, oblivious. The escort made no aggressive move, no alarms, no evasive action. The convoy simply sailed on, as if an American submarine hadn't just surfaced in broad daylight with hostile intent. "Deck gun crews, to your stations," Shelby called down. Within seconds, sailors scrambled topside to man the 4-inch deck gun. The weapon swung toward the tanker, and the first shell screamed across the water before the Japanese even realized what was happening. This wasn't stealth. This wasn't caution. This was something the Imperial Japanese Navy had never anticipated, and couldn't seem to counter a submarine attacking on the surface, in daylight, with the confidence of a destroyer. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The question that haunts military historians isn't whether American submarines transformed the Pacific War they demonstrably did, but rather how Japanese naval leadership allowed their merchant marine to be slaughtered with such systematic efficiency that by late 1944, submarine captains like Shelby could surface in daylight and hunt tankers like wolves among sheep. The answer reveals one of the war's most profound ironies. The nation that pioneered carrier warfare and surprise attack devoted so little attention to protecting its own supply lines that American submariners faced less resistance in 1944 than they had in 1942, despite 2 years of war experience. To understand how this happened, we must return to the beginning of the Pacific War and the doctrine that shaped the Imperial Japanese Navy's entire strategic philosophy. In December 1941, when Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto unleashed his carrier, strike force against Pearl Harbor, he did so with a fleet built around a single, overriding concept: the decisive battle. For decades, Japanese naval theorists had studied the Battle of Tsushima, where Admiral Heihachiro Togo annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet in 1905. That victory, achieved through superior gunnery and aggressive tactics, became the template for all Japanese naval thinking. The combined fleet existed to seek out and destroy the enemy's battle line in one climactic engagement. Every resource, every strategic decision, every officer's career advancement, all oriented toward this singular vision of naval warfare. This meant, in practical terms, that the unglamorous work of protecting merchant ships fell far down the priority list. Convoy escort duty was considered a waste of fighting ships. Anti-submarine warfare received minimal attention in training. The best officers commanded battleships and carriers, not the humble frigates and destroyers that would be needed to defend against submarines. When war came, Japan possessed the 3rd largest merchant marine in the world, approximately 6 million tons of shipping, but had made almost no serious preparation to defend it. The Americans, meanwhile, had been preparing for a very different kind of war. The development of the Gato-class submarine in the late 1930s gave the United States Navy a weapon perfectly suited for commerce raiding. These boats displaced 2,400 tons, submerged, and could travel 12,000 miles without refueling. They carried 24 torpedoes and had a crushing depth of 300 feet. More importantly, They were designed for long-range patrols across the vast Pacific, capable of staying at sea for 90 days. When Admiral Harold Stark ordered unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan 6 hours after Pearl Harbor, he unleashed these boats on a merchant marine that was almost completely undefended. But the early years of the submarine war were marked by frustration rather than triumph. The Mark 14 torpedo, the submarine force's primary weapon, was plagued with defects that made it nearly useless. The torpedoes ran deeper than set, their magnetic exploders detonated prematurely or not at all, and even when these problems were corrected, the contact exploders often failed. Submarine captains fired spread after spread at Japanese ships, only to watch their torpedoes pass harmlessly beneath targets or strike without exploding. The Bureau of Ordnance, with characteristic bureaucratic stubbornness, insisted nothing was wrong with the torpedoes and blamed the submariners for poor shooting. It took 21 months until September 1943 before the submariners themselves, through their own testing and modifications, finally fixed the Mark 14's defects. By then, an entire year of war had been wasted. Submarines that should have been sinking hundreds of ships managed only modest successes. Japanese merchant captains, who sailed through 1942 and 43 with relatively light losses, developed a false confidence. The American submarine threat, they concluded, had been overestimated. Their escorts could handle these underwater attackers. This Japanese complacency was reinforced by their own doctrinal blindness. In November 1943, the Imperial Navy finally established the Grand Escort Command to coordinate convoy operations and protect merchant shipping. It was a step in the right direction, but it came far too late and with far too little support. The command received mostly obsolete ships, vessels deemed unfit for fleet operations. The most capable escorts were routinely transferred away to the combined fleet for offensive operations. Personnel assignments followed the same pattern. Graduates from civilian marine schools handled convoy duty, while the properly trained naval officers went to carriers and battleships. The Grand Escort Command was supposed to save Japan's merchant marine, but it was given neither the tools nor the authority to do so effectively. The Japanese also lacked the technological edge that might have compensated for their doctrinal failures. Radar had begun appearing on American submarines in late 1942, giving them the ability to detect targets and track convoys at night with devastating precision. Japanese escorts didn't receive radar until mid-1944, and even then, the sets were inferior to what the Allies possessed. Japanese destroyers, which formed the bulk of convoy protection, had impressive night fighting capabilities. They were among the finest torpedo-armed ships in the world, but they had significant deficiencies in the sonar and depth charge equipment needed for anti-submarine work. It was as if Japan had built a navy specifically designed to fight World War I-style surface engagements, and was now discovering that the enemy had moved on to a different kind of warfare entirely. While Japanese anti-submarine doctrine stagnated, American submarines underwent a revolution. The year 1943 marked several critical turning points. First, in January, American codebreakers cracked the Maru code, the Japanese crypto system used to route merchant ships through Empire waters. Every Japanese convoy now sent position reports at noon, 0800 and 2000 hours. American intelligence officers at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific in Hawaii could plot Japan's freighters, tankers, and transports in real time. Gone was the guesswork of earlier patrols. Submarine captains now received precise information about convoy locations, courses, and speeds. All they had to do was position themselves along the predicted route and wait. Second, Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarines Pacific Fleet, affectionately known as Uncle Charlie to his crews, began systematically replacing cautious submarine captains with more aggressive ones. The early war had been marked by commanders who were too conservative, too worried about destroyers' sonar, too reluctant to press home attacks. Lockwood identified the warriors' men like Dudley Mush Morton of the Wahoo, who pioneered aggressive surface attacks, or Richard O'Kane, who would sink 24 ships in just 9 months of combat in 1944. These captains didn't wait for perfect setups. They maneuvered their boats into the heart of convoys, fired from close range, and attacked multiple times in a single night. Third, by late 1943, the Mark 14 torpedo finally worked reliably. The electric Mark 18 torpedo, which didn't leave a telltale wake, began entering service. Submarines had the weapons, the intelligence, the tactics, and the leadership to wage devastating commerce war. The stage was set for 1944, which would become the worst year in history for Japanese merchant shipping. The transformation became apparent in the hunting grounds. In the Formosa Strait, the South China Sea, off the Philippines, and even in the approaches to the Japanese home islands, American submarines found targets with increasing regularity. The broken Maru Code meant that submarine captains could anticipate where convoys would be 24 hours in advance. They could position themselves perfectly, wait patiently, and strike with near certainty of success. The Japanese, meanwhile, had no idea their codes were compromised. They continued sending position reports in the clear, effectively broadcasting their locations to the enemy. Lieutenant Commander Lawson Red Ramage exemplified this new breed of aggressive submarine captain. In mid-June 1944, commanding the USS Pash, Ramage intercepted a large Japanese convoy between Formosa and Luzon. What followed was perhaps the wildest surface engagement in submarine history. Ramage brought Pash to the surface at night and drove straight into the middle of the convoy formation. With Japanese cargo ships and escorts milling around him in confusion, he fired torpedoes in every direction, reloading and shooting again as opportunities presented themselves. Escorts tried to ram him. Merchant ships attempted to run him down. Ramage dodged, maneuvered, and kept firing. At one point, the Pash found herself surrounded by escorts on every side, with a passenger cargo vessel bearing down to ram. Ramage avoided collision by just 50 feet, spun the boat around, and sank 2 tankers in quick succession. When dawn finally broke, Pash had sunk the 10,000-ton tanker Koei Maru and the 4,000-ton Manko Maru, along with several other vessels. For this action, Ramage received the Medal of Honor. But Ramage's wild surface attack, spectacular as it was, took place at night under the cover of darkness. By mid-1944, some submarine captains were taking even greater risks. They were surfacing in daylight. The logic was brutally simple. Japanese air patrols over convoy routes had become sparse and disorganized. Japanese escort vessels lacked radar and had proven incapable of effective counterattacks, even when they knew a submarine was nearby. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine emphasized passive defense zigzagging, smoke screens, evasive routing rather than aggressive pursuit. Most damning of all, by late 1944, there simply weren't enough Japanese escorts to cover every convoy, and those that existed were often poorly trained and equipped with inadequate depth charges and sonar. The combination created a tactical environment where surfacing in daylight, while still dangerous, was far less risky than it should have been. Tankers were the most valuable targets, and American submarine captains knew it. Japan's entire war economy depended on imported oil from the southern resources area, the Dutch East Indies, particularly Borneo. Before the war, Japan had estimated it needed to import approximately 28 million barrels of oil annually to sustain both its civilian economy and military operations. In 1944, Japan managed to import less than 5 million barrels. The primary reason for this catastrophic shortfall was simple. American submarines were sinking tankers faster than Japan could build or repair them. Every tanker sent to the bottom represented not just lost fuel, but lost industrial capacity, lost mobility for the combined fleet, and lost strategic options for Japanese commanders. The pattern repeated across the Pacific. In February 1944, an important oil tanker convoy consisting of the Goyo Maru and Ariake Maru was annihilated by submarines in the middle of the East China Sea. The convoy had been escorted by a frigate of the best type available, the Sado, displacing 1,020 tons. One escort for 2 tankers was, at that point, the best protection Japanese headquarters could provide. It wasn't enough. Both tankers went down. The frigate, for all its modern equipment, proved helpless against submerged attackers who could track the convoy's position through broken codes and strike from any angle. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By autumn 1944, the situation had become desperate for Japan. American submarines had sunk 603 ships that year, totaling 2.7 million tons more than they had sunk in the entire war up to that point. Combined with losses to aircraft and mines, Japanese bulk imports fell to 60% of the previous year's totals. Submarine captains reported that formerly busy convoy routes now stood empty. Japanese shipping had been forced into coastal waters too shallow for submarines to operate, or at least, that was the theory. In practice, aggressive submarine captains found ways to hunt even in these restricted areas. They would surface at night or in early morning light, sometimes even in full daylight, and use their deck guns to engage targets. The 4-inch and 5-inch guns mounted on American submarines weren't particularly powerful by naval standards, but they were more than sufficient to destroy lightly armed merchant vessels and small coastal craft. Submarines would approach a convoy, surface at range, and begin systematic bombardment. Japanese escorts, if present, would fire back, but their gunnery was rarely effective, and they lacked the speed to close quickly enough to force the submarine to dive. The British submarine force, operating in the Far East from bases in Ceylon and later Fremantle, adopted similar tactics by March 1945. Having gained control of the Strait of Malacca and finding few large Japanese ships remaining in their operational area, British submarines primarily attacked small craft with their deck guns. It was economical torpedoes, were expensive and in limited supply, and it was devastatingly effective against the coastal shipping that Japan increasingly relied upon. The psychological impact on Japanese merchant sailors was profound. They had entered the war believing their navy could protect them. The combined fleet, after all, was one of the most powerful naval forces in the world. It had sunk the Prince of Wales and Repulse. It had swept through Southeast Asia with stunning speed. It had fought the Americans to a standstill at the Coral Sea and achieved a tactical victory at Java Sea. Surely such a navy could defend merchant ships from submarines. Instead, these sailors found themselves on vessels that travelled with inadequate escorts, using defensive tactics that didn't work, through waters where American submarines operated with near impunity. Worse, as the war progressed, even the limited escort protection deteriorated. Japanese destroyers and frigates were being sunk by American submarines and aircraft, faster than replacements could be built. By late 1944, many convoys travelled with reduced or no escort, simply because none was available. The merchant sailors knew what this meant. They were steaming through submarine-infested waters in ships that stood almost no chance if attacked. The irony deepened when considering Japan's own submarine force. The Imperial Navy had developed excellent submarines. Boats like the I-class cruiser submarines were larger and longer-ranged than their American counterparts. Japanese submarines had scored significant victories early in the war, sinking the carrier USS Wasp and damaging several other major warships. But Japanese submarine doctrine, like all Japanese naval doctrine, focused on fleet operations. Submarines were supposed to scout for the main battle fleet and attack enemy warships, not waste time on merchant vessels. This meant that while American submarines were strangling Japan's economy, Japanese submarines were conducting largely futile patrols searching for American carriers that were rarely where Japanese intelligence predicted they would be. Admiral Lockwood's submariners understood they were winning the economic war. Intelligence reports confirmed that Japanese fuel stocks were plummeting. Convoy schedules grew increasingly erratic as Japan struggled to find enough escorts and operational merchant ships. Most tellingly, by December 1944, submarine captains reported that their assigned patrol areas, which should have been rich with targets, stood nearly empty. The Japanese merchant marine, or what remained of it, had retreated to coastal waters and night runs, trying desperately to avoid the submarine gauntlet. This is where the title of our story becomes literal. By late 1944 and early 1945, American submarine captains had become so confident in their tactical advantage that some, though certainly not all, began surfacing in daylight to attack tankers and other high-value targets. The decision depended on several factors: the presence or absence of air cover, the quality of the escort, the tactical situation, and the individual captain's assessment of risk. But the fact that any submarine captain would even consider surfacing in daylight speaks to how thoroughly Japanese anti-submarine warfare had failed. Consider the mathematics of the situation. In January 1945, Japan needed to import millions of barrels of oil to sustain minimal economic operations. In reality, a few tankers made it through literally just a handful of vessels that succeeded in running the blockade. American forces, having taken the Philippines, Guam, Midway, Saipan, and Okinawa, sat astride Japan's vital oil lifeline from the south. The American submarine force, numbering close to 100 fleet boats by that point, patrolled every major shipping route. Japanese convoys that ventured out did so knowing that American submarines likely already knew their course, speed, and composition through the compromised Maru Code. The human cost was staggering. American submarines didn't just sink ships, they killed the people aboard them. Japanese soldiers, being transported to reinforce distant garrisons, died by the thousands when submarines torpedoed troopships. In 1944 alone, as Japanese military planners shifted focus from the Asian mainland to the Pacific theatre, they put vastly more soldiers afloat than ever before. 12 divisions from the elite Kwantung Army, previously stationed in Manchuria facing the Soviets, were redirected to counter American advances across the Pacific. These men travelled on ships that were increasingly vulnerable. Research has revealed that American submarines killed at least 97,000 Japanese soldiers during the war, more than the Marine Corps and the U.S. Army killed in the Central Pacific Drive from Tarawa to Iwo Jima. Allied prisoners of war and slave. Labourers suffered an equally tragic fate. The Japanese used ordinary merchant ships, later called hell ships by survivors, to transport prisoners between territories. When American submarines attacked these vessels, they had no way of knowing Allied prisoners were aboard. In September 1944, the submarine USS Paddle attacked a Japanese convoy and sank the Shinyo Maru. Of 750 Allied prisoners of war aboard, 668 were killed, either in the attack itself or murdered by their guards. Only 82 Americans survived. The crew of the Paddle wasn't informed that they had inadvertently caused the deaths of hundreds of American prisoners until 1946, after the war ended. These tragedies underscore a brutal reality of commerce warfare. When submarines attack merchant vessels, everyone aboard dies, regardless of nationality or circumstance. The American submarine campaign was effective precisely because it was indiscriminate. Any ship flying the Japanese flag or operating in Japanese-controlled waters was a legitimate target under the doctrine of unrestricted submarine warfare. This included tankers crewed by civilian Japanese merchant sailors, many of whom had no military training and wanted no part of the war. It included troop transports carrying soldiers who drowned by the hundreds when torpedoes struck below the waterline. It included the Allied prisoners who should have been protected under international law, but instead became casualties of a war fought without mercy on either side. The transformation of submarine tactics from cautious to audacious didn't happen overnight. It emerged through a series of small revelations, each building on the last, until certain submarine captains reached an inescapable conclusion. Japanese anti-submarine defenses had become so degraded that the old rules no longer applied. Commander Richard O'Kane, perhaps the most successful submarine captain of the war, exemplified this evolution. Before taking command of the USS Tang in October 1943, O'Kane had served as executive officer under Dudley Morton on the legendary Wahoo. Morton had pioneered aggressive surface attacks, but even he operated primarily at night. O'Kane took his mentor's lessons and pushed them further. During the Tang's third patrol in June and July 1944, O'Kane hunted in the waters between Japan and Korea, an area that should have been heavily defended. Instead, he found convoys traveling with minimal escort and no effective air cover. On the morning of July 3rd, Tang sighted a tanker and a freighter near the coast. O'Kane first sank the freighter Taiun Maru No. 2, then surfaced to chase the fleeing tanker Takatori Maru No. 1 throughout the day. When darkness fell, he closed to torpedo range and sent the tanker to the bottom. The next morning, July 4th, Independence Day, O'Kane celebrated by conducting a submerged attack on an enemy freighter that had taken shelter near shore. The water was so shallow that Tang's keel scraped bottom, forcing O'Kane to back off. But he fired anyway, scoring 2 hits on the Asukazan Maru, then surfaced to watch survivors being rescued by fishing boats. That same afternoon, Tang sighted and sank another cargo ship, the Yamaoka Maru, with 2 torpedoes. What's remarkable about this sequence isn't just the number of ships sunk, though 10 ships totaling 39,000 tons on a single patrol was exceptional, but rather O'Kane's tactical confidence. He surfaced in broad daylight, in coastal waters, near enemy territory, and operated for hours with apparent impunity. Japanese air patrols, which should have forced him deep, never materialized. Coastal defense forces, which should have mounted coordinated counterattacks, never appeared. O'Kane had discovered what other aggressive captains were learning. By mid-1944, large portions of Japanese-controlled waters had become free fire zones, where American submarines faced minimal opposition. The British submarine force made similar discoveries in their operational area. By March 1945, British boats had gained control of the Strait of Malacca, the critical waterway between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula. With few large Japanese ships remaining in the region, British submarines began hunting coastal traffic junks, fishing boats, small cargo vessels with their deck guns. Commander Anthony Mears, commanding HMS Torbay, described the tactical situation in his patrol report. Japanese vessels had no radar, minimal radio communication, and escorts that rarely coordinated effectively. Submarines could surface, approach within gun range, sink their targets, and submerge before any response materialized. This wasn't just happening in peripheral areas. Even in the waters approaching Japan itself, the homeland that should have been most heavily defended, American submarines operated with startling freedom. The USS Tang, on its 4th patrol in August 1944, hunted off the coast of Honshu, the main Japanese island. O'Kane attacked patrol boats with his deck gun in broad daylight, destroying vessels that were specifically tasked with anti-submarine operations. On August 14th, Tang engaged a patrol yacht with 8 direct hits from the deck gun, reducing the vessel's superstructure to wreckage. 8 days later, O'Kane sank another patrol boat on the surface. These weren't merchant ships, they were military vessels with crews trained to fight submarines, and they were being destroyed on the surface, in Japanese home waters, by an American submarine that felt confident enough to remain surfaced during the engagement. The psychological shift this represented cannot be overstated. In December 1941, when the first American submarines departed Pearl Harbor on war patrol, their captains had been deeply concerned about Japanese air power, destroyer threats, and the possibility of being trapped in shallow waters. Doctrine emphasized caution, stealth, and submerged attacks from maximum range. Now, less than 3 years later, submarine captains were surfacing to fight gun duels with Japanese military vessels in the enemy's front yard. What had changed? Everything and nothing. Japanese naval power hadn't vanished. The combined fleet still included powerful battleships, cruisers, and carriers. But these ships were concentrated for fleet operations, held in reserve for the decisive battle that never came. Meanwhile, the mundane but critical work of defending merchant shipping and coastal waters fell to second-rate vessels with poorly trained crews, inadequate equipment, and no doctrine for dealing with aggressive submarine attacks. Japanese anti-submarine aviation provides a stark example. In January 1944, the Japanese Navy activated the 901st Naval Air Group, the first air unit created, exclusively for anti-submarine warfare. This should have been a major improvement. In practice, the unit was rushed into service before its pilots had received proper training. The airmen had no doctrine for anti-submarine operations. They had to develop tactics from scratch, learning through trial and error, while already engaged in combat operations. Communication between aircraft and surface vessels was almost non-existent. Most merchant ships lacked radio equipment capable of coordinating with friendly aircraft, and even many escort vessels couldn't communicate directly with air patrols. More fundamentally, the 901st Air Group suffered from the same resource starvation that plagued all Japanese anti-submarine forces. By late 1944, Japan's aviation fuel stocks had declined so drastically that many aircraft remained grounded. Combat aircraft were husbanded for defending against American carrier strikes or for kamikaze attacks against invasion fleets. Long-range maritime patrol work, which requires hours of flight time scanning empty ocean for the occasional submarine contact, consumed fuel that Japanese commanders believed was better spent on offensive operations. The result was that American submarines often operated under skies devoid of Japanese aircraft, even in areas that should have been under constant aerial surveillance. Radar technology, or rather, Japan's lack thereof, compounded these problems. American submarines had been equipped with surface search radar since late 1942. This gave them an enormous tactical advantage in night attacks. A submarine could track a convoy from beyond visual range, maneuver into optimal position, and attack before the Japanese even knew they were there. Japanese escorts began receiving radar sets in spring 1944, but the technology was primitive by Allied standards and installed far too late to make a significant difference. More critically, the radar operators often lacked training in using the equipment effectively. Having radar meant nothing if the operator couldn't interpret the scope or if communications with other vessels were too slow to coordinate a response. The statistical evidence of Japanese anti-submarine failure is damning. In February 1944, submarines sank Japanese shipping at a rate of approximately 250,000 gross tons per month. This triggered some reforms. Japan finally began organizing large convoys with better escort protocols. But when Japanese convoys grew larger and better protected, American submarines simply adopted wolfpack tactics, with multiple submarines coordinating attacks on a single convoy. The countermeasures were nullified almost as soon as they were implemented. By autumn 1944, the nature of the submarine war had fundamentally changed. In December, submarine captains reported that their assigned patrol areas, which should have been rich with targets, were largely empty. Japanese merchant shipping had essentially ceased to exist in deep water. What remained operated in shallow coastal zones or made desperate night runs between ports, hoping to avoid submarine patrols. This collapse created a new problem for American submarine commanders. Finding targets had become difficult, not because Japanese defenses were effective, but because there were barely any ships left to sink. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, watching this unfold from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, recognized that one major hunting ground remained, the Sea of Japan itself. This body of water, wedged between the Japanese home islands and the Asian mainland, had been considered off-limits since October 1943, when the submarine USS Wahoo was lost attempting to exit through La Perouse Strait. Lockwood believed the Japanese had heavily mined the entrances to make further incursions impractical. But by late 1944, he had a potential solution: frequency-modulated sonar, a device originally intended for minesweepers that could detect mines on an electronic screen and emit a clear chime which submariners nicknamed Hell's Bells when close to an obstruction. In June 1945, Lockwood launched Operation Barney. 9 submarines equipped with FM sonar penetrated the minefields of Tsushima Strait and entered the Sea of Japan, an area the Japanese called Hirohito's Lake and considered a safe haven. For 2 weeks, these submarines operated inside Japan's most protected waters, sinking 27 ships and a dozen smaller craft. The psychological objective, Lockwood later explained, was to convince the Japanese that having lost control even of the Sea of Japan, their last avenue to the outside world, further resistance was futile. By the time the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, Japan's maritime lifeline had been severed. The nation that required millions of barrels of imported oil to function was receiving almost nothing. Industrial production had collapsed. The combined fleet, starved of fuel, remained in port. Troop transports couldn't move reinforcements. Supply ships couldn't deliver food to distant garrisons. The submarines had achieved what strategic bombing and surface naval victories alone could not. They had strangled Japan's ability to sustain the war. The human cost of this achievement remains difficult to fully calculate. American submarines sank approximately 1,300 Japanese merchant and naval vessels, totaling over 5 million tons. Tens of thousands of Japanese merchant sailors died, many of them civilians with no military training. Japanese soldiers drowned by the thousands aboard troopships. Allied prisoners of war were killed when submarines unknowingly attacked hell ships. The commerce war in the Pacific was total, indiscriminate, and devastating in its efficiency. For the submarine crews themselves, the experience was transformative. They had entered the war with doctrine emphasizing caution and had emerged as aggressive raiders operating with near impunity. The progression from cautious submerged attacks to bold surface engagements and finally to daylight hunting represented a complete reversal of pre-war expectations. These men had discovered that the enemy they faced, despite possessing a powerful surface fleet and formidable naval aviation, had failed to develop effective countermeasures to submarine warfare. The irony cuts deeper when considering Japan's own submarine capability. The Imperial Navy had excellent submarines and skilled crews. Japanese submarines scored significant victories throughout the war, sinking major warships, including carriers. But Japanese submarine doctrine remained wedded to fleet operations and attacks on military targets. Japanese submarines weren't tasked with destroying American merchant shipping, even though such a campaign might have significantly disrupted American logistics across the Pacific. Instead, Japanese submarines conducted largely futile patrols, searching for American carriers, while American submarines systematically dismantled Japan's economic infrastructure. This represents perhaps the war's greatest strategic blindness on Japan's part. The nation fought a defensive war, defending captured territory, defending shipping lanes, defending the homeland while maintaining an offensive naval doctrine designed for aggressive fleet engagements. The mismatch between strategic reality and tactical doctrine created vulnerabilities that American submariners exploited ruthlessly. Japanese merchant sailors, watching their escorts prove helpless against submarine attacks, developed a fatalistic view of their prospects. They knew that traveling by sea meant accepting a high probability of death. They knew that the Navy couldn't protect them, that their ships lacked adequate defensive equipment, and that American submarines tracked their movements through broken codes. Some convoys traveled without any escort simply because none was available. Merchant crews steamed through submarine-infested waters, knowing they were essentially defenseless. Consider the perspective of a Japanese tanker captain in late 1944. He commands a vessel carrying oil from Borneo to Japan, oil that the military desperately needs, oil that represents strategic value far beyond his ship's monetary worth. He knows American submarines hunt tankers with particular intensity. He knows his escort, if he has one, consists of perhaps a single frigate or destroyer that lacks radar and has demonstrated repeated inability to prevent submarine attacks. He knows the route he must follow has been transmitted via codes that may be compromised. And he knows that if a submarine attacks, his best hope is to be near shore, where the water is too shallow for the submarine to operate. Submerged, but even that advantage has eroded, because American submarines now sometimes surface to attack with deck guns. This tanker captain faces not just danger, but near certainty of eventual loss. If not on this voyage, then the next, or the one after. The mathematics are brutal. Tankers are being sunk faster than they can be replaced, faster than new crews can be trained, faster than the yards can conduct repairs. Each voyage reduces the odds of survival. And yet the oil must get through, because without it, the war effort collapses entirely. By early 1945, even these desperate voyages had largely ceased. The few tankers still operational made short coastal runs, hugging the shore, traveling only at night when possible, hoping to escape notice. But American submarines, using radar and intelligence from broken codes, continued to find and destroy them. The question was no longer whether Japan's maritime supply line would be severed, but how soon the consequences would become catastrophic. The answer came in the war's final months. Without oil, the combined fleet couldn't sortie. Without raw materials, factories couldn't produce. Without food imports, civilians went hungry. The strategic bombing campaign against Japanese cities receives more historical attention, but the submarine blockade was arguably more decisive. American submarines had achieved what Germany's U-boats never managed in 2 world wars. They had effectively destroyed an island nation's merchant marine and severed its connection to overseas resources. The submarine captains who pioneered daylight surface attacks never sought glory for their tactical innovations. They were pragmatic warriors who recognized an opportunity and exploited it. They surfaced in daylight because the tactical situation permitted it, because Japanese defenses had degraded to the point where the risk became acceptable, and because their mission strangling Japan's economy demanded maximum aggression. These captains understood that every tanker sunk shortened the path's war, that every cargo ship destroyed reduced Japan's ability to resist, and that their actions, however ruthless, were hastening an Allied victory that would ultimately save lives by preventing a prolonged conflict. The men who served aboard these submarines, the officers, the torpedomen, the engineers, the lookouts, the cooks, endured conditions that tested human endurance. They spent months at sea in steel tubes, breathing recycled air, eating food that grew stale and bug-infested, never knowing when depth charges might crush their hull or when a torpedo malfunction might send them to the bottom. They dealt with the psychological burden of killing enemy sailors who, like themselves, were just men trying to survive a war. And they did this patrol after patrol, voyage after voyage, year after year. 48 American submarines were lost during the Pacific War, taking 3,500 men down with them. These casualties were proportionally higher than any other branch of the U.S. military. Submarine duty was voluntary. No one was forced to serve aboard these boats, and yet volunteers kept coming, kept training, kept deploying, because they believed in their mission and trusted their captains. When the war ended and Japan surrendered aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Admiral Chester Nimitz ensured that Admiral Lockwood had a place in the front row at the ceremony. It was fitting recognition for the submarine force's contribution to victory. The boats that had entered the war with defective torpedoes and cautious doctrine had emerged as the most effective commerce raiders in naval history. The legacy of the Pacific submarine campaign influenced naval warfare for decades afterward. It demonstrated that commerce raiding remained a viable strategy in modern warfare, that submarines could decisively influence a war's outcome, and that even a powerful navy could be vulnerable to sustained submarine attack if it failed to prioritize anti-submarine warfare. These lessons shaped Cold War submarine doctrine and continue to influence naval strategy today. For Japan, the lessons were learned too late. By the time Japanese naval leadership recognized the existential threat posed by American submarines, the merchant marine had already been decimated. Reforms came in piecemeal fashion, always too little and too late. The Grand Escort Command never received the resources it needed. Convoy doctrine never evolved to counter wolfpack tactics effectively. Technology upgrades never caught up to American capabilities. And the fundamental doctrinal bias toward offensive fleet operations never changed until the war was already lost. The story of why submarine captains started surfacing in daylight and sank dozens of tankers before Japan could react effectively is ultimately a story about institutional failure. Japan's navy, brilliant in so many ways, fatally neglected the unglamorous work of protecting its own supply lines. The Americans, meanwhile, corrected their early mistakes, adapted their tactics, and prosecuted the commerce war with relentless efficiency. By late 1944, that combination had produced a tactical environment where American submarine captains could surface in broad daylight and hunt Japanese shipping with the confidence of apex predators. The Japanese sailors who witnessed these daylight attacks must have felt a particular kind of despair. They were being hunted on the surface, in full view, by submarines that no longer feared them. The submarine, that most stealthy of weapons, had become bold enough to expose itself in daylight because the defences arrayed against it had proven so consistently ineffective. It was the ultimate symbol of Japan's maritime defeat, not just that American submarines were sinking their ships, but that they were doing so openly, almost contemptuously, because 3 years of warfare had proven that Japan couldn't stop them. This asymmetry American aggression against Japanese impotence defined the submarine war's final phase. The hunters had become so dominant that the old rules no longer applied. Stealth gave way to audacity, caution gave way to calculated risk-taking, and the submarine captains who embraced these changes discovered that the Pacific, once contested water, had become American territory in all but name. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.